should turn their videos off, right?
Yes, please. Does that include us or panelists on?
Hello. Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for attending this session on the Action Coalition on Feminist Movements and Leadership. My name is Bronwyn Tilbury, and I'm the Feminist Movement Strengthening Advisor at the International Women's Development Agency, based on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people in the Kulin Nations, as also known as Melbourne, Australia. I'd like to pay my respects to the Wurundjeri people on whose unceded lands I'm joining you from today. IWDA is so proud to have been working with feminist colleagues from around the world on the Action Coalition on Feminist Movements and Leadership for the last year or so, and I am equally excited to be moderating this session for you today. Our coalition envisions that by 2026, feminist leaders and feminist-led organisations and movements, including those led by trans, intersex and non-binary people, Indigenous women, women and people with disabilities, young feminists and other historically excluded people are fully resourced and supported to become sustainable, can carry out their work without fear of reprisal and advance gender equality, peace and human rights for all. And we hope today's session will be able to add to the building momentum and energy around that vision. The session will start with some introductions and context setting before we move into a panel discussion on the contents of our draft blueprint. After the panel, we'll have 25 minutes for questions from the audience, so please start thinking of your questions now. Following that, we will talk about the commitment makers model, and then we'll have a bit more time for questions before we close. Just a few reminders before we get started. We have translation available. So if you require this, please click on the globe symbol at the bottom of your screen as indicated on the slide and select your preferred language. Panelists, just a reminder to please unmute yourselves and turn your cameras on in order to go on stage, and then turn them off when you go off stage. And audience members, you can ask questions throughout the session in the question function at the bottom of the screen. Unfortunately, we don't have the ability to translate questions. My sincere apologies for that. So if you could contribute your questions in English if possible, that would be great. We are also putting some links in the chat right now for the full text of the draft blueprint. So follow those links if you'd like to read the full text and comment on the draft. I'm just checking. We were supposed to hear from Sabine Fraser Gunesh from UN Women now. Sabine, are you with us? It doesn't seem so. So we'll move on to an address by Deputy Executive Director of UN Women, Anita Bhatia. Anita, are you with us? Okay, no Anita either. That's okay. We're getting off to an excellent start. All right, we'll move on to, I'd like to introduce now the Minister for International Development from the Government of Canada, Karina Gould. She has...
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Bronwyn,
Anita.
can you hear me? Yes.
Yes, we can hear you.
Sorry, I seem to have the wrong link, but
That's
I have the right link now. So
we have you here now.
Yes, great to see
so
you, and good afternoon. Well, I hope it's afternoon somewhere. Good evening, good night to all who are joining us. Good morning. I'm sure we have people from around the globe joining us. So really a very warm welcome to all of you, and a real pleasure for me to be here on behalf of UN Women. I want to start by first just saying a really big thank you to Hannah and to Sarah, who have been the co-leads of the Action Coalition process and have, through their hard work and the work of partners such as yourselves, brought us to this point. So really a huge thank you to my UN Women team, and also a very big thank you and appreciation to the governments of Mexico and France, without whose stewardship and partnership UN Women and civil society partners would not be at the stage where we are today. Thank you so much, Bronwyn, for your introduction of this really important theme. I want to underscore how very critical this issue of feminist leadership and feminist movements is at this point in our history. We are truly at an inflection point where we have the opportunity to turn this crisis into an opportunity. But we will not be able to do that unless we take some very significant, different, ambitious, and transformational steps to build a different kind of world. And the reason I say that is this. We knew already last year in 2020, even before the pandemic hit, based on the reviews that we were receiving from different countries of progress made since the Beijing event took place 25, well now 26 years ago, that progress in areas like political representation, like feminist leadership, was actually very minimal. In general, I think we know that progress on the Beijing platform has been spotty at best. We've seen advances in maternal mortality, in access to education, improvements in health outcomes for women, and some improvements in political representation. But if you just stop to think for a minute that we're in 2021, it is actually astonishing and almost like science fiction to say that we are at a point in history where we have been able to solve for many, many problems, but we still have only 13 countries in the world that have gender equal cabinets. We have only 25% of national legislators worldwide being women. We have less than 10% of heads of state who are women. And we have 119 countries in the world that have never had a female leader. That is hard to believe, and that is the reality that we must change. The second thing I want to say is that the pandemic has demonstrated clearly the value of feminist leadership. It is only through our connection to women's organizations and women's rights groups throughout the world that UN Women was able to paint a picture of exactly what the impact of the pandemic on women has been. Without the ground truthing that is provided by feminist organizations and women's groups, we would not have been able to ring alarm bells for the world to point out what was happening. Last point that I want to make is that it is essential that we fund this area of work properly. Women's groups have been decimated by the pandemic. It is therefore essential for all partners, whether they are member states, private philanthropy, or others, to think about ways to support and keep alive women's groups. The face of the pandemic, ladies and gentlemen, is the face of a woman. And we have seen today and yesterday the courage and the bravery of women, not just through the pandemic, but in the fight for democracy and human rights. Whether it is Belarus or Beirut, Myanmar or Sudan, the face of protest, the face of democracy is that of a woman. VP Kamala Harris said at the Commission on the Status of Women, the status of women is the status of democracy. We need to preserve, uplift, and support that status. And that is the important work that this Action Coalition has been doing. I want to congratulate each and every one of you who has been working so hard to get us to the blueprint stage, and to wish you the very best of luck in your discussions today, because your discussions will help to move these blueprints into real commitments. And that is ultimately what is going to help us to build back equal. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Anita. It is truly astounding, as you say. We do have Sabine here with us now. Sabine Fraser-Gunesh from UN Women is now going to paint us a picture of the journey of the Action Coalition so far. Sabine?
Good morning, everybody, or good evening. Thank you so much, Bronwyn, for the introduction. Thank you so much, Anita, for your inspiring words. I just wanted to say a little bit about the journey that we have all traveled to get to this point. We have had amazing leaders of this Action Coalition and of others who have been working for over a year to get to where we are today. So it's really a big celebration for all of us to be able to have reached the point where we are today, and to be able to introduce to you the blueprints of the Action Coalitions. So thank you so much to all the leaders and to all the partners who have been on this journey, who've been working so hard over the past year to get to today. It has really been a co-creation. It has really been a step-by-step process, which is necessary to mark the 26th year of the Beijing Platform for Action. When we realized how little we have been able to implement of the Beijing Platform for Action, it became very obvious that we needed something that would really push forward, that would really inspire and get us to where we are today. As Anita has pointed out, the COVID-19 pandemic has made this even more relevant and even more necessary than before, as we have seen how the pandemic has unduly affected women and girls, economically, politically, and socially. These action coalitions are more important than ever. So as you can see on your screen, I hope, the journey has been one full of colors and full of excitement and high points, which began in 2020 with the governments of France, Mexico, together with UN Women, civil society, and youth, agreeing that it was the time to set up the Generation Equality Forum and the Action Coalitions. So we began back then in 2020 and slowly built up to where we are today, collecting a large number of leaders of action coalitions. So as you can see here on this diagram, there's at least 95 leaders across the 6 action coalitions. And these leaders come from governments, from civil society, from feminist organizations, from the private sector, from youth, and other stakeholders. And so this is a really unique effort, because we are coming together despite which types of organizations we represent, despite which part of the world we are coming from, despite our ages, despite a whole source of differences. We are managing to come together through the leadership model that this Action Coalition has created, and together have built up the Action Coalition blueprints through design sprints, through many different workshops, through meeting together, some in person before the pandemic, and then afterwards online over the past year. So this journey has been one of co-creation, of really building up consensus, of really building up an agreement on what is needed to push forward to ensure that feminist movements and feminist leadership can over the next years really shine and be able to push forward on the implementation of Beijing. So we have developed bold, transformative blueprints, and across the 6 action coalitions, this means 24 different actions that we are calling on the world to implement over the coming years. The blueprints will ensure that concrete actions will affect the millions of lives of women, girls, adolescents, and that we are really able to meet the promise of Beijing. The blueprints of the Action Coalition on Feminist Movement and Leadership will address crucial challenges faced by women and girls in their access to equal rights through concrete actions on sufficient funding. So an action calling for sufficient funding of women's rights organizations and movements, an action on the promotion, expansion, and protection of civic space for feminist action, organizing, and mobilization, increased access to leadership and decision-making, and finally, an action to support youth leadership. We'll hear a lot more about these actions over the next few hours together. So I just wanted to close by saying this is now a moment where we're also moving into the next stage, where we're calling on the world to come in as commitment makers. So to make concrete commitments to implement the actions of this Action Coalition to ensure change. So we'll talk more about that a little bit later. And now I'd like to hand back to Bronwyn and to the speakers to introduce the Action Coalitions and the blueprints in more detail. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sabine. And you will have noticed the beautiful illustrations there. We actually have a graphic recorder with us in the room today who's going to be recording the discussion. So look out for that at the end of the session. Thank you. Next, we have, I'd love to introduce Minister for International Development of the Government of Canada, Karina Gould, who has a pre-recorded message in response to the question, why should we focus on feminist movements and leadership? Why is it urgent? And what does the Action Coalition on Feminist Movements and Leadership aspire to achieve in 5 years' time?
I am pleased to join the rest of my co-leaders in presenting the work of the Feminist Movements and Leadership Action Coalition. Over a year ago, when the Generation Equality Forum was just getting started, the need to focus on supporting feminist movements and the leadership of women and girls in all their diversity consistently emerged as the key issue for the GEF to tackle. That was true a year and a half ago when we started this journey together. It is even more urgent now. The global pandemic showed us that women are disproportionately affected by the crisis while being largely excluded from decision making. Even a year into the crisis, a recent survey shows that women made up less than a quarter of COVID-19 task force teams, and almost 1 in 10 did not include women at all. At the same time, the Black Lives Matter movement sparked debate about racist structures in society. Feminist leadership is a key tool to catalyze change, and the need for that feminist leadership is more urgent than ever. Some governments have used the pandemic to justify intimidation of human rights defenders, especially those in marginalized situations. Canada is concerned about increased threats faced by women journalists. We were saddened to hear of the death of 3 Afghan women journalists earlier this year, who were killed leaving the TV station where they worked. Not only are these attacks on individuals, they are attacks on our democratic freedoms. The work of women's rights organizations, human rights defenders, and women's peace builders have been deeply affected by COVID-19. But it is also the women's rights organizations that hold the solution. They have the contacts, the trust, and understand what works in their own context. This is why Canada launched both the Women's Voice in Leadership and the Equality Fund initiatives. Women's Voice in Leadership was a program created to directly meet the needs of local women's organizations in developing countries. Through Women's Voice in Leadership, we have partnered with women's rights movements on the ground in Nigeria, helping small-scale farmers to sell their goods online when commerce pivoted away from street markets. In Honduras, we have invested in women's groups fighting for the rights of Honduran women and girls whose lives have been affected by violence. Building on the learning from Women's Voice in Leadership, we worked with a group of amazing feminists to build a sustainable source of funding for women's rights organizations through the Equality Fund. The Equality Fund brings 3 important pillars together for supporting feminist movements: granting, gender lens investing, and funds mobilization. The first vehicle of its kind in support of feminist movements, its aim is to provide an ongoing, sustainable, and flexible source of funds. But we know that the demand and the potential for funding for feminist organizations and movements far outweighs the currently available funds and resources globally. That is why we must work together to build alliances and cross-collaboration to bring in more and better funding for feminist movements. We have also aligned our foreign policy to a feminist vision. For example, with our Feminist International Assistance Policy, we have committed that 95% of development cooperation will integrate or target gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls. We do this so women, girls, and gender diverse peoples and their allies can be agents of change and improve their own lives and those of their families, communities, and countries. Girls in particular face multiple layers of discrimination based on age, gender, and other identity factors. We appreciate the work of our co-leaders to prioritize the role of girls and adolescent girls within the Action Coalition. In 5 years' time, if we are asked if we really took action, we want to be able to look back and say resoundingly, yes. We must ensure that we create a lasting legacy for women and girls in all their diversity to lead. That means funding and supporting feminist, women-led movements and organizations. It means creating civic space for feminist action and advancing gender parity in decision-making and leadership. It means building intersectional feminist and gender transformative policies and practices into everything we do. And it means strengthening adolescent girl-led and youth-led movements. Over the next 5 years, we will work to implement the actions and tactics identified by the Action Coalition. As we make these commitments, we also invite other partners from all sectors to join our global movement. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Minister Gould. We'll now welcome our panel to present the draft blueprint on feminist movements and leadership. It's very exciting to be revealing this to the world for the first time. First up, we have Subha Wijesiriwardena, who's the Program and Innovations Manager with CREA. Subha, if you could kick us off by speaking to the principles that we have established for the Action Coalition. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Bronwyn, and welcome everyone. It's really great and exciting to be here with you all today. And I'm Subha, and I work with CREA. CREA is a global feminist human rights organization led by feminists in the Global South. And before I get to the principles themselves, Bron, I also wanted to just begin by talking a little bit about the process, right? Because the process for us was very much about having those principles in action. So we have been attempting to practice feminist leadership in critical ways which shift and share power, both within our Action Coalition while also trying to articulate those principles in our action statements. So we have tried not to just conceptualize and contemplate what feminist leadership really means to us, but also to practice it with each other. Fundamental to our work in the Action Coalition have been the principles of inclusion and diversity, acknowledging that feminist movements too have been sites of exclusion, ensuring that our feminist power analyses didn't reinforce binary formulations, right? Such as men, women, global south, global north, young, old, etc. And that it acknowledged inequalities at the geopolitical level, but also within regions, countries, communities, and of course, within and across movements. So some of the definitions and principles that we worked with, right? The first was that we use the term feminist-led organizations and movements to refer to people, activists, groups that A, work from feminist and women's rights perspectives, B, are led by the people they serve, C, push for structural change, and the most important, I think, work on contested issues. We recognize that women and girls are not a homogeneous group and that varying circumstances and conditions mean that diverse women and girls are varyingly located along axes of power, privilege, and oppression. So the principle of intersectionality. As feminists, we wanted to commit to a transformative agenda for gender equality, which went beyond the gender binary and includes those who have historically been excluded from feminist organizing, such as both trans feminine and trans masculine people, intersex women and men, and non-binary people. We recognize that feminist leadership is about what you do with power and not simply about who holds power. And finally, but importantly, we recognize the invaluable contributions being made even today by young feminists and girl-led movements around the world, and wish to prioritize the leadership and participation of young feminists and girls. And while we have advocated tirelessly for accessibility and inclusion from the start for folks with disabilities, Indigenous women leaders whom we are lucky to have in this Action Coalition, and others, of course, we know that we are still missing many voices in our Action Coalitions. And that brings me to my next point, the final thing that I want to talk about in this intervention, the question of accountability. We believe that as civil society and as feminists that we have a distinct duty to hold each other and all Action Coalition leaders and stakeholders accountable and to high ethical, moral, and political standards. We have to acknowledge that the process at times may have failed principles of democratism, transparency, and power sharing. At the same time, I know that we all have the shared experience of everyone in this space really wanting to do their best in this process and bringing everything to it. The entry of private sector actors in the Action Coalition as leads, I think, has been an interesting opportunity and a challenge for us as civil society. But it is one which calls on all of us to further interrogate what the purpose of the Action Coalitions are and what implications they can have. Private sector actors in the Action Coalitions should be held accountable to feminist principles like everyone else, and we believe they can work to transform the harm caused by corporations on people and planet. As civil society, we take our own accountability very seriously. We are accountable to our partners, our movements, and fundamentally to those whose human rights we claim to work to advance, who are themselves agents of change and transformation. we are also both rights bearers and duty bearers. So our role is complex and manifold. But finally, collectively, we and all of you, the citizens of this world, should ultimately be the judges of whether governments, the UN, other multilateral bodies, international organizations, corporations, and we as civil society have all lived up to the commitments that we have made as part of this process. Thanks, Bron, and I'll stop there for now.
Thank you so much, Subha, for that excellent contribution. You're right. It is what we do with power that matters, and we are all in this Action Coalition acutely aware of the power that we hold. Our next four panelists will speak to the 4 action areas of the blueprint on feminist movements and leadership. So first of all, we have Amanda McRae, Director of UN Advocacy with Women Enabled International, who's going to speak to Action Area 1. What does the Action Coalition hope to achieve with this area in the coming 5 years, and how? Over to you, Amanda.
Thanks so much, Bronwyn. And I just want to start by saying that we at Women Enabled International are very happy to serve as one of the leaders of this Action Coalition and are honored to present this first action, or proposed action, from our blueprint for gender equality and transformative change. And that first action is, by 2026, double the global annual growth rate of funding from all sectors committed to women-led and feminist-led movements, organizations, and funds in all their diversity, including those led by trans, intersex, and non-binary people. As many of you know, feminist-led organizations and movements remain chronically under-resourced. Women's rights organizations and movements receive less than 1% of official development assistance committed for gender equality and women's empowerment. And similarly, little funding flows from private philanthropy. In 2014, only 8% of gender-focused aid to civil society organizations went directly to those in developing countries as well, compounding that issue. As an NGO that works at the intersection of gender and disability, Women Enabled and our sisters around the world rely on consistent sources of funding to do our work, and on funders who will listen to and adopt our priorities, rather than making us adapt to theirs. This first action challenges states, philanthropic organizations, and other funders to significantly increase the funding available to our sisters, and to be thinking about the diversity of feminism when doing so. In turn, this increased funding will help ensure that women in all of our diversity have the means to have a seat at the table on all issues, and that in our work as feminist movements and organizations, we can also prioritize the issues most important to us. So with that in mind, we have 3 tactics that fall under this action that I want to briefly present to you today. The first of those, of course, relates to financing. And simply, we hope to increase funding to feminist activists, organizations, and movements working in partnership with women's funds and other existing funding mechanisms. This is including diversifying who is providing this funding and expanding the pool of funding overall for feminist activists, organizations, and movements. A second tactic focuses on laws and policies, and that means ensuring that more and better funding is accessible to feminist organizations, movements, and activists, and adopting and upholding feminist funding principles in all types of funding and resource mobilization. Now, what are feminist funding principles? Those include a lot of the things that Subha just touched on, which includes recognizing and addressing power dynamics, including between funders and feminist organizations, ensuring that funding is going to those that are most impacted by gender inequalities, ensuring an intersectional lens in that funding to break down silos, ensuring that funding is flexible and is targeted at sustaining organizations, not just projects, And I think many of us can relate to that in this COVID-19 crisis, having flexible funding and core funding being so important. And then also supporting capacity building and leadership within organizations, among a number of other principles that inform a feminist funding core. A third tactic we propose under this action is related to data and accountability, and that is to improve transparency of funding for feminist-led, women-led, and girl-led organizations, to prioritize accountability to these groups, and to support them to monitor funder investments. This we see as a way of shifting power in these relationships between funders and the organizations receiving funding, to ensure that the funding provided by those funders is responsive to the rights and needs of feminist organizations and movements, and thus of women in all of our diversity as well. So thank you again, and I look forward to your thoughts and comments on this action.
Thank you so much, Amanda. I'd like to now bring in Zenaida Perez Gutierrez, Program Director with Asamblea Nacional Política de Mujeres Indígenas. Zenaida, can you tell us a bit about Action Area 2? What does the Action Coalition hope to achieve in this second area? Thank you.
Muy buenas noches a todas las personas que nos escuchan. Y buenos días también para quienes están en otros países. Mi internet está un poco débil, entonces posiblemente tenga que apagar la cámara para que me escuchen. Para la acción 2, ojalá que me estén escuchando. Para la acción 2 justamente quedó el promover, ampliar y proteger el espacio cívico para la acción de las organizaciones y movimientos feministas. Entre estos, se acordó que en la parte de leyes y políticas será necesario pues adoptar las medidas de protección y políticas, así como legislación para proteger los derechos humanos y la seguridad de las activistas, organizaciones y movimientos feministas en toda su diversidad. Nosotras somos mujeres indígenas que integramos la Asamblea Nacional Política de Mujeres Indígenas. Ha sido un desafío participar en estos espacios porque el principal idioma ha sido el inglés. Y bueno, con este desafío de la brecha digital también, que a estas horas en nuestras comunidades se complica un poquito más, por eso pues ofrezco las disculpas por esta debilidad en la señal, pero con gusto comparto los acuerdos que se han tomado en relación a la acción 2. Dentro de los compromisos para modificar las leyes y políticas que fortalezcan al movimiento feminista, se convoca a las organizaciones de todos los sectores a fortalecer el respeto e implementación de los mecanismos de protección y de derechos humanos internacionales, regionales y nacionales en el espacio cívico, que atienda las demandas y experiencias de las activistas, las organizaciones y movimientos feministas. Los estados deben eliminar las medidas, prácticas, leyes y políticas punitivas que afecten a las activistas, organizaciones y sus movimientos. Dentro de la rendición de cuentas será necesario rastrear y documentar todas las violaciones de derechos humanos contra activistas, organizaciones y movimientos feministas. Dentro de los compromisos que se plantean inicialmente es que todas las organizaciones de todos los sectores, estos actores múltiples, están convocados a monitorear, documentar e informar sobre amenazas, ataques, acoso, violencia y otras violaciones de derechos humanos contra activistas, organizaciones y el movimiento feminista. También estos actores deberán financiar el desarrollo de metodologías y la recopilación de datos desglosados sobre discriminación interseccional y ataques contra activistas, organizaciones y movimientos feministas, no solo presencial o física, sino también en línea. Este informe pues ayudará a la protección del movimiento y también compartir las buenas prácticas basadas en la evidencia. Otro de los compromisos es transformar las normas, que busca profundizar esta solidaridad dentro de los movimientos feministas y también con otros movimientos por la justicia social. Busca eliminar los estereotipos que refuerzan la discriminación, la desigualdad y estigmatizan a las activistas, sus organizaciones y a todo el movimiento feminista. Para hacer realidad este cambio de normas, algunos de los compromisos planteados es que todos estos múltiples actores, como ya se mencionó, que están parte de los gobiernos, las empresas, las propias organizaciones, las fundaciones, los múltiples actores invierten, identifican y actúan en conjunto para eliminar justo las normas nocivas de género, las narrativas antigénero y antiderechos, la discriminación, el estigma, el acoso y la violencia contra las activistas diversas, como ya se decía, personas con discapacidad, personas indígenas, afromexicanas y toda la diversidad de mujeres que existen. También a sus organizaciones y todos los movimientos. De nuevo, tanto de manera presencial como digital, porque hacia allá va también el trabajo, pues de manera también más reciente, ¿no? Esto se puede lograr a través de campañas de educación y sensibilización cívicas. Otro de los compromisos es que todos los actores múltiples apoyan estos esfuerzos y coadyuvan para que se profundice la solidaridad dentro del movimiento feminista, entre estos movimientos y con todos los movimientos que buscan la justicia social. Entonces, esos son los planteamientos que se han hecho en este plan y compromiso de acción número 2. Muchas gracias.
Thank you so much, Zenaida, and thank you for your contributions despite the significant barriers of language and the internet. Next, we have Stephanie Green, Senior Director of Global Philanthropy from Gucci. Stephanie is going to speak to us about our third action area. Thanks, Stephanie.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for your time to support this Critical Action Coalition, and thank you to my fellow co-leads who have collaborated so diligently, thoughtfully, and passionately on these blueprints. Building on what my fellow co-leads in this session have shared, action number 3 is to advance and increase meaningful participation, leadership, and decision-making power of girl leaders and of women and feminist leaders in all their diversity, including those who are trans, intersex, non-binary, Indigenous women, women and people with disability, young feminists, and other historically excluded people. We know that structural barriers continue to exclude girl leaders, women and feminist leaders from decision-making at all levels, and this action aims to catalyze commitments that confront these barriers. For change to be realized, organizations and institutions across sectors must practice feminist principles and leadership. We must shift and share power with historically excluded groups and people. We have used the phrase, quote, in all decision-making spaces, end quote, in our action blueprints. This is very specific, intentional language to communicate the application at every level, as Subha mentioned earlier too, even in our own processes and engagement as an action coalition. Thank you especially to the youth leaders of our Action Coalition and the broader Generation Equality Youth Task Force for pushing us to uphold a truly feminist, inclusive process and challenging us to have transformative and bold design, co-creation, and change as outlined in the Youth Manifesto. Within this action dedicated to increased meaningful participation, leadership, and decision-making power, we are focusing on 2 areas. Firstly, we are calling for advancing gender parity in all aspects of public and economic decision-making, including the private sector, civil society, international organizations, political and government institutions, including executive and legislative positions. And secondly, we are also calling for the promotion and expansion of feminist, gender transformative, and inclusive laws and policies. We will achieve this core action through tactics within the areas of laws and policies, data and accountability, education norms, and financing. So going through each of those areas, within laws and policies, we want to see the development and implementation of policies and regulations to advance gender parity and to ensure the participation of women, girls, and non-binary people in all their diversity in decision-making. Policy that is developed and implemented with feminist activists, organizations, and movements is critical to ensuring inclusion, to ensuring that gender equality is at the center, and to ensuring that there is equal access to opportunity in all aspects of public and economic life. For data and accountability, the data that we have now is insufficient to track the unique experiences of women and girls. So we must prioritize and finance the gender data we need to deliver transformative change. And that is why, to realize this action, we are calling to conduct and to communicate intersectional feminist analysis, including analysis of data in the preparation, implementation, and monitoring of policies, budgets, and laws. We need the collection of intersectional, age, and gender-sensitive poverty data, including data on women who have historically been excluded. And it's not just about collecting metrics and numbers for the sake of having them. This data is critical to inform policies moving forward, feeding into the previous point about laws and regulations. In education, we are calling for action to build cross-sector alliances. We need to support mentoring, experience, and capacity sharing with feminist activists, organizations, movements, and leaders. And we need to cultivate, welcome, and support intersectional and multi-generational dialogue. We need to all ask, are we truly supporting girls, women, and feminist leaders in all their diversity? Are we confronting the power structures and moving beyond tokenism? And are we learning from the lessons of previous generations to build a more inclusive and therefore effective movement? The commitments we seek within education aim to address these questions and to drive solutions to truly active, effective, and inclusive participation. Within norms, we are calling to address harmful stereotypes and gender norms to ensure that decision-making power is had for feminist activists, organizations, and movements. We need culture change to promote feminist leadership and participation. And finally, financing. We need real investment in gender mainstreaming and gender budgeting mechanisms in all levels of government, the private sector, international organizations, and civil society organizations, and all sectors of the economy. We need to ensure that the implementation of these mechanisms is inclusive and intersectional. We look forward to your feedback on this action and to the commitments that will come to bring the goals of this action to life. We truly hope that you will join us in encouraging organizations and institutions to be a part of this coalition. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Stephanie. And now for our final action area 4, I'd like to welcome Kavita Ramdas, Director of the Women's Rights Program with Open Society Foundation. Kavita, you have the floor.
Thank you, Bronwyn, and salam, namastes, and warm greetings to all our colleagues in all the different parts of the world from wherever you are. It is really my pleasure as someone who has been a longtime feminist activist and passionate advocate for girls and women's rights around the world to speak about Action Area 4, which is focused on strengthening adolescent girl-led, youth-led, and youth-serving movements and organizations by creating environments for girls and young women that allow them to speak openly about their needs, their wishes, and their lived realities, so that they can participate meaningfully in the decisions that actually make a difference in their lives at all levels, and ensure their own access to explicit, flexible funding and all of the other resources that they need. Some may ask, why is it important for an action coalition like ours, which is focused on feminist movements and leadership, to have a special focus on girl-led or youth-led movements and organizations? I think we actually don't need to answer that with words so much as we simply need to point to those who are making change. For those of us who lived in the United States, we know that the Black Lives Matter movements and the protests this last summer were organized primarily by young women, primarily young women still in high school, so they were girls. For those who need to look to questions of climate justice, you only have to look at Greta Thunberg and her posse or squad, a squad that traverses continents with the degree of mobilization and organization that the school strike for climate has demonstrated. It's very clear to us that girls and feminist youth of all genders have incredible power and incredible strength, and that we actually have not given them the space and the environment that they really need, other than sort of framing them within either we must protect or we must educate. And I think that one of the things that this Action Coalition is so excited about is that we see a much broader understanding of the vision of education. It is not one that focuses narrowly on facilities, on school buildings, or on books, but rather focuses on an education that prepares girls to be full, active, and equal participants in society and in the decision-making processes from their homes into society at large. It seems clear to us that we are building for the future and that we have much to learn from the young people around us, even as we address the problems of the present, and that in many ways it is girls and young feminists who are powerful agents for change in their own communities. We believe in investing in leadership, in people who are already imagining what is possible, not confining themselves to what we have lived with for all these past decades. If the pandemic has taught us anything, it is that it is time for us to step through the pandemic as a portal into the future, and it is young feminists who are leading the way for us. For us, we have heard from so many of the Generation Equality participants in the last few days how difficult it is for youth-led organizations to access not only decision-making spaces, but the resources, funding and otherwise that are so critical for them to be able to make those decisions. For us as an Action Coalition, this commitment also makes visible our own intent to build and shift power dynamics even within feminist movements. I think it was made very clear by our earlier speakers that we must recognize in our own movements trends towards exclusivity and ageism. And there is a real need for us to begin to ensure that girls and adolescents and young feminists can own the processes, the policies, and the decisions that will affect their lives. Our hope is that we will continue to benefit from the recent intergenerational dialogue space that we have had in our conversations with Plan International that helped convene that, where we heard directly from younger feminists about their priorities, and we also hope that that will continue. We believe that it is incredibly important for us to introduce civic and human rights education early on in schools to address the lack of knowledge, uninformed and harmful gendered norms, and stigmas and taboos that are associated with women's bodies, ourselves, as well as with our power and our ability to lead in many different spaces. Second, we believe it is important to strengthen girl-led movements by ensuring that they do have access to funding and all the resources that they need, and that the processes that we put in place are actually ones that can be used easily by people of all ages. And finally, we often hear about creating a safe environment, but I would say the young feminists of today are challenging us to talk about brave environments. Brave environments are those that do not try to protect, do not try to defend, and do not approach this work from a place of defensiveness, but rather holds a full sense of girls in all their power, recognizes that their leadership is in lots of different ways and lots of different spaces, and ensuring that we can redirect policies that can actually be in favor of their development and their voice and power, whether that is in online spaces or whether that is in real physical spaces. I think that we have, lastly, a great amount, I think, to learn from the many young women and young feminists that we've seen both in this coalition as experts, but also certainly for me as an activist in many of our interactions around the globe. And perhaps I can end with a quote that I shared with participants at Mount Holyoke College when I gave a commencement speech. I said at the end of that speech that we need women who are so strong they can be that they can be gentle, so educated that they can be humble, so fierce that they can be compassionate, so passionate that they can be rational, and so disciplined that they can truly be free. That is what I believe young feminists have taught us. They have manifested that to us, and we are excited to be able to take their work forward in this action coalition. We're looking to the future. Please join us.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Kavita, for that rousing final contribution. You'll see a poll that's just popped up in your screens. What you've just heard is the culmination of much work amongst the coalition members to establish productive and power-sensitive working arrangements, to negotiate language and ensure that we are being ambitious and inclusive. We have not always achieved those ambitions, and we're committed to improving our practice in the coming months. It's worth repeating that this is very much a draft blueprint. This is the first time we are presenting these actions as a whole to you, our stakeholders around the world. And we're really, really eager to hear your reactions to the draft blueprint and work with you to strengthen and enrich this draft over the next few months before Paris. So as you can contribute to the poll, we're now moving into a bit of time for questions from the audience. So thank you for your contributions of questions in the chat so far. I'll start with this one. How will girls' safe and meaningful participation be institutionalized in the Feminist Movements for Action Coalition to ensure that girls are a part of decision-making in the design, implementation, and accountability of the blueprints? Do any of our panelists want to respond to that first question?
I can make an effort at that, Bronwyn. I think some of the most critical issues that I think we have to address are that there has been for some time now a real disassociation between the very nice language that we've heard about educating girls and the language that we also hear primarily around sexual and reproductive rights about protecting girls from early pregnancy, but with very little understanding about the power and the agency that girls must have over our own bodies, over their own bodies, and the ability to actually recognize that our bodies are sources of power and pleasure as well. And I think that until we get to a point where we are actually able to call on nations to actually step up and make that commitment very visible. Two very concrete examples: the United States, which is currently, for the first time ever, has a vice president who is a woman, is one of very few countries in the world that has refused to sign CEDAW, which is the Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women and Girls. One of the major reasons it has failed to sign that is because it refuses to admit the basic concept of equal pay for equal rights. The Equal Rights Amendment has just actually been surfaced inside the United States, and I think that offers us a great opportunity. A second and similar one is that the United States has also failed to sign the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and there again, one of the primary reasons is that they are against the idea of sex education for young people. I think if we really want to make a difference for young people and recognize this in the sense that we make it real, I think we actually have to hold the feet of our fellow nations and governments around the world to a certain standard. They can't be holding forth on human rights on the one hand and failing completely to stand up for the rights of girls in their own countries on the other. And I think within feminist movements, the notion of intergenerational leadership, the fact that we do not only learn from gray-haired people like myself, but actually quite the contrary, that young people have so much to teach us and are teaching us about anti-racism, about anti-sexism, about climate change. These are not things that we are teaching them, they are teaching us. And I have great hope that in the way that we frame our work going forward, it will be their leadership to ensure that their voices are heard and not so much, we will be doing a good job if we can sort of step out of the way and give the space. I think that will be something that we can do in a very effective manner. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kavita. Another question that's come through, it's important to make sure the participation of grassroots women leaders in spaces like this. Let's try to facilitate their participation. We can't see them just as the base of the problem only. We need to make sure they are part of these decision-making spaces like this. We can't leave them behind. Does anyone want to respond to that comment?
I mean, I can jump in just because I think that this question actually does sort of resonate to the earlier question as well, which is really about the process, right? And about participation in the process. And I think, it can be any group that we feel are not adequately represented in this space. And I think, there are many, and I think there have been many of those conversations along the way. I think, if we are serious about it being a process that actually can do the transformative work that we, wish it would, I think then, I can only speak for civil society really, right? And what I think our role should be. And I think, that we have to continue to hold ourselves and everyone else in the process accountable to this question of greater transparency, more participation, more consultative decision-making processes that are more inclusive, right? And where we see more diverse people represented. I think the commitment makers model is one such opportunity, but I also want us to not stop there. I want to encourage us to also really think seriously about what it would mean if we were to have a really democratic action coalition process. And it may have, even if we've had disappointments so far at times, it doesn't have to be the same. Like we can change it. We can change it going forward. This is a 5-year commitment for the leads. So, I think it's my sort of appeal to us as civil society leads maybe to do better in holding ourselves and all the stakeholders in this process accountable to a more democratic and more transparent process, I think.
I totally agree with you there, Subha. I think with the Mexico Forum happening this week, for me at least, and for the people we're working with in the Pacific and Asia region, this is a moment where we're feeling more bold to actually influence the process to be more inclusive and to be more democratic, because to date it has been difficult to see how we can be bringing some of those voices into the process. I think it's now really time that we step up as leaders in a more transformative way. Did anyone else want to respond to that? Or I have another question. Okay, this one's from Sophia Poire. There's a huge challenge to avoid substantial ruptures in feminist movements. There are those who militate against trans rights and sex workers, those who call themselves pro-life feminists and militate against abortion, and many people who prefer to desert the feminism for more intersectional and decolonial movements. I would like to know if from the second action, you will be able to suggest actions that contribute to the resolution of these kinds of conflicts, strengthen alliances, and of course, not giving in to anti-rights agendas. Who would like to respond to that one?
First, I just want to say that's such an excellent question. And I think it's such a, it's such a profoundly important issue for all of us in any movement. I think it's very important to recognize that I think Subha said it at the beginning, we are not a monolith. Just like any movement, we have our range, our diversities, our, there are, we agree on some things, but not on everything. At the same time, I think that it is important. I was just rereading, as you may remember, last week, we lost a giant in feminist activism and theory, Nawal el-Saadawi from Egypt. And she famously said that it is not our job to mollify patriarchy. It is our job to dismantle it. And I guess I would say that in the context of these questions, we have to recognize that we are movements and activists and individuals working within the framework of a highly capitalist, highly patriarchal, highly militarized society that it still hasn't even been willing to come to terms, as Greta Thunberg says, our house is on fire. We don't even want to acknowledge climate change is real. So, where to speak of all these other levels. So I think for me, it is a question of one, recognizing what our colleague has correctly put in the question, which is just recognizing that we have these challenges, recognizing that we won't always have easy answers, but trying to keep ourselves as open to listening and to hearing rather than reacting and shutting down and saying, because I disagree with you on the question of abortion means that I can't talk to you about anything else, or because we disagree on the question of, whether we think private corporations are the cause of everything that's wrong in the world, we can't discuss anything else. I think we are much too sophisticated for that. It is 2021. We have had to build alliances in multiple movements. Labor rights organizers have had to mobilize. We've had to mobilize in climate justice work. We've had to mobilize on work for anti-militarism. So my hope is that we bring a certain degree of humility and openness and courage. It's not so much safe spaces as brave spaces that I think will help us to have these dialogues with one another. But Subha and others, Zenaida, por favor, su voz es muy importante para nosotras. And Amanda, I think
Yes.
you can, yes.
Yeah, hi. Just adding to what Kavita has said, I also do think that it is in some circumstances okay for us to draw lines too in terms of our movement and in thinking about our movement and what we see as being feminist. So drawing lines about transphobia or ableism or racism or those sorts of things that are in line with human rights standards and human rights principles and in line with our values. So just wanted to add that to what I thought was Kavita's really great answer to that question.
Thank you. I very much agree with that. I think we also have to know where we take a stand. So very much with you on that, Amanda.
Subha, Zenaida? Okay, we have another question about accountability. Oh, Stephanie, sorry.
No, I just would like to very humbly say that I don't know what the answer is. And my hope is that, the great quote that we are stronger united and we can accomplish more together than what our differences separate us between. But I also do very much agree with Amanda that there are what I would consider very clear boundaries too, that we need to uphold to stay true to our principles as well. But my hope is that, and especially coming from a very politically divided country right now, where we're seeing, similar issues or comparable issues playing out within families, for example, people who can't even talk to each other. I agree with Kavita that just having the space to have a dialogue is the first step. But I don't unfortunately have a very polished answer, just that I can see the vision of unity and the hope for that and how we get there. Perhaps you can all collaborate on the answer to that together.
Thank you, Stephanie. I have one final question for this part of the program. It's around accountability. It's important to assess what grassroots women contribute and what government agencies give a real account of their investments for grassroots women. I think this question gets to the question of, you know, these ambitions, these actions that we've written down are all very well. How are we going to hold duty bearers, whether they be governments or other multi-stakeholders, actors, to account for actually delivering on these ambitions?
Subha, would you like to start?
I was hoping, could we bring Zenaida in?
Yeah, I think if Zenaida can speak, it would be great.
Yeah. I hope the interpretation is working. Is it working?
It might just take a few minutes. We'll wait Zenaida for a few minutes.
Sí. Sí. Decirles que justo porque es interpretación, llega despacio, llega un poquito después, entonces cuando se abre la posibilidad de participar, ya alguien más tomó la palabra. Entonces, de la respuesta a la pregunta anterior, yo quiero compartir la esperanza de que dentro de esta coalición, por lo menos de liderazgos y movimientos feministas, se ha dado la discusión. Quienes hemos sido poblaciones históricamente excluidas, racializadas y que estamos presentes en ese espacio, hemos tratado de poner ciertos temas, por ejemplo, nuestra identidad indígena, la necesidad de las traducciones, la necesidad de incorporar otras identidades, y se ha abierto el diálogo. Tratamos de que esto fuera englobado en lo que hemos llamado la interseccionalidad, pero creo que falta mucho, como lo han expresado aquí. Quiero compartir que pues este es un ejercicio, una primera etapa del trabajo que es un comienzo, por eso se está exponiendo como a lo público, para que justamente con sus preguntas, sus comentarios, sus opiniones podamos fortalecer esta propuesta, ¿no? Y que de acuerdo a lo que pues la mayoría de las que participen aporte, se pueda consolidar un mejor documento, una mejor agenda, que bueno, ya al final, hacia Francia, hacia unos meses, se pueda realmente consensar y tener una guía de acción tanto para gobiernos, empresas, las propias organizaciones, el propio movimiento. Y creo que una tarea pendiente que siempre está dentro de los diferentes espacios es dialogar entre nosotras justamente, ¿no? Desde dónde se habita o qué cuerpos habitan y asumen este movimiento, y también quienes están quedando fuera, ¿no? Creo que ya hemos enunciado las brechas en múltiples ocasiones. Se ha dado también un trabajo previo de mujeres con discapacidad que también se reúnen en este contexto y nos han hecho ver cómo hacer para que cada vez más estos espacios en los que nos encontramos den la posibilidad de que la diversidad o las personas históricamente excluidas puedan estar y participar en condiciones de igualdad en estos espacios. Esa sería la contribución mía, y por supuesto que asumimos y reconocemos que no están todos los grupos, porque también la dinámica en la que nos fuimos enterando de la convocatoria fue tal vez mucho más a través de los medios digitales, y justo como lo dicen las que comentan, las organizaciones de base, no todos tienen acceso a lo digital, y no tienen acceso también a estas redes que puedan hacerle llegar la información. Esa sería mi participación.
Thank you so much, Zenaida. Okay, any final comments on that last question? All right, well, in that case, it's time to share with you the poll. So you can see there that there's a lot of support for the financing of feminist and women-led movements, which has been a key, foundational conversation within the coalition so far. And then substantially increasing of feminist and women-led organisations, again, is the key action that people are excited about. We're also excited about eliminating harmful gender norms, anti-gender, anti-rights narratives, and collecting better data and analysing data to inform policies that meet the needs of women and girls, which is something that my organisation is particularly passionate about. Okay, just before we move into the commitment makers model, I'd like to just hand the mic around to our panelists for one last reflection on the discussion that we've just been having. Kavita, maybe we can start with you.
Thank you. I think what we've heard is actually a reflection of partly the deep sense of inequality that currently exists. I think we began with a clear statement about how little in terms of total amount of resources currently goes to support women and girls organizing and feminist organizing around the globe. How few resources go, whether it's through official aid or whether it's through private philanthropy. I think the role of women's and feminist funds is incredibly important at this moment of time. I think we have to kind of fund our own revolution, if you will. And I think that is partly what the experience of feminist funds has taught us. I still remember very vividly that Tewa, the Women's Fund in Nepal, began with the founder, Rita, challenging her middle-class Nepali friends to take a gold bangle off their hands and put it on the table and say, let's start this fund with a bangle each. And I think until we begin to really own our own power around changing the resource dynamic, instead of constantly feeling that we have to go with, with a begging bowl, as it were, but rather consider this to be a right, that these are the resources we have a right to, and that people should feel very lucky and fortunate to be able to invest in our work. I think that's the message that we're getting loud and clear. So I'm really excited about taking that work forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Amanda?
Sure, thanks, Bronwyn. Message that I'm taking forward beyond the funding piece, which is so very clearly so important to so many of us, both in the audience and on this panel, is also thinking about the diversity of feminism and how we infuse that diversity throughout the blueprint. I think we've taken steps in that direction, but what I think we've heard from some of the comments and questions is that there's more that we need to do to have that democratic process that Subha was talking about, to be including voices from throughout the movement into this part of our blueprint, and frankly, throughout the blueprint altogether, to ensure that it is broadly representative of the feminism that's out there. And yeah, I will leave it at that. Thank you.
Thanks, Amanda. Stephanie.
Thank you. Well, I'm left wanting to address some of the intergenerational questions that were brought up, some in the chat, which we didn't have a chance to address. So very eager to take that back to our Action Coalition and see how we can integrate that in the next version of the blueprints for sure. Coming from the corporate perspective and hearing the full blueprints presented, and it's different when you take a step back and hear it versus we've been very much in the weeds, I would say. And I'm just struck by the many, many references to the private sector. And I think that there is just a very huge opportunity to leverage the power of the corporate sector for good. And consumers have now been demanding more and more from companies. And I think there's just a real opportunity for corporations in the private sector to come in as allies to transform the way that they do grant making and traditional corporate social responsibility and philanthropy. We know that so many brands and corporations have taken on quote, women's empowerment as a certain initiative within the company, and really challenging what does that mean? How can we evolve those traditional corporate ways of working through this action coalition is really exciting to me, and something that we didn't necessarily have a chance to dive into with the dialogue, but certainly a theme that we see cutting across that we'd like to carry forward.
Thank you, Stephanie. Zenaida.
Hola.
Yes.
Bueno, voy a hablar, ya no escucho la traducción. De acuerdo. Pues también quiero compartir que, como lo mencioné al inicio, somos una asamblea de mujeres indígenas organizadas a nivel nacional. Nos da muchísimo gusto ser parte de este proceso. Creo que en el ejercicio nos hemos dado cuenta sobre las brechas, como ya lo mencioné, pero también hemos demostrado que tenemos el ímpetu y las ganas de seguir sumando a las reflexiones, sumando con nuestras contribuciones, sumando con nombrar las realidades que a cada una nos toca vivir. Y ahora quiero aprovechar a enviar este saludo a mis compañeras que están pues en diferentes comunidades, en diferentes regiones de aquí nuestro país, México, que ahora es anfitriona de este evento global. Y nos da muchísimo gusto saber también que con todas las dificultades, con todas las asimetrías, podemos hoy ser partícipes de un evento global donde, como lo hemos demandado a primera voz, hacemos escuchar nuestros planteamientos, nombramos nuestras realidades y tomo nota de esto que han expresado, ¿no? Cómo hablar, seguir dialogando sobre la diversidad sexual, sobre el capacitismo, sobre pues las múltiples identidades que nos configuran como mujeres y las identidades étnicas, en este caso mujeres indígenas. Y lo de las juventudes también quiero reconocer que también en el marco de este foro ellas se han reunido, han sacado un pronunciamiento que creo que lo más que nos corresponde es suscribirlo, conocerlo y también pues incorporarlo en los trabajos posteriores, en los trabajos que siguen. Agradecer pues a ONU Mujeres y a todas las instituciones que han permitido que este diálogo se realice y que, bueno, como lo dije, este es el inicio de un camino que se irá fortaleciendo a mediano plazo y que en 5 años veamos que las cosas han mejorado un poco más con el apoyo de todas y todos por ser pues gobiernos, empresas, organizaciones, y que con la suma de esfuerzos sí podemos construir una sociedad mejor para todas y todos. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Zenaida. Please, Subha.
Thanks, Bronwyn. I think the thing that I would want to sort of bring back or sort of, remind us, so to speak, is the piece about movements, right? Because I think that movements are, of course, it's a sort of critical part of the Action Coalition's work, but I think, the question that we had about anti-gender, anti-rights mobilizations in the Q&A, etc. I think clearly we know that, among us as well as out there among, other communities, colleagues, etc., we know that there is this anxiety about what do we do? What do we do about opposition? And I think the only answer that we can have is to build stronger movements and to take better care of each other and to strengthen our networks of solidarity, because I really do think that all the things that make up movements need to sort of be visibilized, right? And there's many invisible elements to movements, right? We know that we kind of sit on layers and layers of invisible, labor, etc., that make it possible for us to do what we do. And I do think that strengthening, those bonds is and can be our only sort of answer to anti-gender, anti-rights mobilizations. Sorry, on that note, I just want to take a quick minute to really acknowledge and express deep appreciation for our technical lead, Mariam Aslan, who is, who I think we all agree has just given a lot of time and energy to this process. And I think, many of us are always left feeling very appreciative for Mariam.
Thank you, Subha, and thank you, Mariam. Okay, we're moving on now. Well, just quickly, a reflection from me as one of the co-leads. Just very briefly, I always say, and we know as feminists that power lies in process. And I think we really need to go back to the drawing board on the process of this action coalition. And I'm committing to do that myself. Okay, so now I'd like to ask some of the panelists, what commitments would you recommend for realizing this vision that we've laid out today? Subha, Amanda, Stephanie, I wonder if you could give us some examples of the game-changing commitments that you're inspired by.
Should I start us off? Amanda, Stephanie, is that okay?
Go ahead, Subha.
Okay, I'll just get us started. So, I mean, I think just on the question of commitments, Bronwyn, I think what, I can speak to really is what, we are doing and what we are discussing to commit to at CREA, which I think can sort of in some way, reflect what we think civil society should be committing to. I think, fundamentally to us, civil society should first commit to being transparent and consultative in this process, and using the privilege that we have been granted as leads in this process to involve our partners across movements and across regions, and to support them to engage with the generation equality process as best as we can and as best as they can, right? And at CREA, I think we really want to kind of renew again and again our commitment to our partners. Because I think there are many of our partners who we really believe belong in this space, at times even more than us, I think. So, we are very cognizant all the time of needing to do that. Further, I think civil society can also really engage critically in strengthening feminist movements and leadership. And I think that is something that feminist organizations really need to start asking, are we doing enough? Because I think that is the work that we are doing, building for our future, right? Really strengthening programming in feminist movements and leadership. For us at CREA, feminist movements and leadership has always been a core strand of our work. It's one of our key strategic objectives. We have institutes that have been running for more than a decade on feminist leadership and movement building. Across regions. We have a program on feminist mentoring for young women leaders. And of course, feminist movement building is a critical issue that we work on, strengthening and building alliances with feminists in other movements and across feminist fault lines. And we are also excited to embark on a new piece of work. And I think this is another thing for civil society to take away, is the second action statement, right, on expanding and defending civic space. And at CREA, we are really excited to be the lead of a new Global South feminist-led consortium, which is critically dedicated to defending and expanding civic space and amplifying the voices of structurally silenced women. And we have undertaken this work with great seriousness and, because it is also new to us. And so we also want to commit to deep learning, listening, and expanding our own thinking. And we commit to increasing the visibility of and amplifying the voices of structurally silenced women in civic space, because we believe that these voices are essential. They are essential to democracy and to social justice. Thank you.
Thank you, Subha. Amanda.
Thanks so much, Bronwyn. And I think many of our the commitments that we are most excited about are really echo the ones that Subha has just mentioned in many ways. We have ourselves, and my apologies, I'm hearing a bit of an echo. Hopefully that will help. We are ourselves at Women Enabled have been examining our own processes for engaging in this process as a model for kind of movement of feminists with disabilities beyond this process as well, and the integration of that movement with the broader feminist movement. And we've been excited to take part in a collective, the Inclusive Generation Equality Collective, as grassroots women with disabilities and other feminists with disabilities, as well as organizations working to advance rights at this intersection as well. And I know some of my colleagues from that collective are attendees in this panel and may be able to share with you some of our work in the Q&A. But this, to us, this has given us this incredible opportunity to work with this diverse group of feminists who are so energized in this process. And for us, a commitment that we hope to see out of this process is moving that forward and having those feminist principles applied to this disability space. Beyond that, we're also very excited about the opportunity to be kind of the commitments related to educating and working with states, funders and civil society organizations to kind of educate and inform and build capacity around the diversity of feminism. This to us is, the key priority we had coming into this process was how do we see feminism beyond, just one certain set of ideals, one certain set of people, and how do we bring intersectionality into that process? So I'm excited to see commitments from others and also to commit ourselves to be educating constantly and building our own capacity as actors in this space to work in that diversity of feminism. So I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Amanda. And Stephanie.
Thank you. I'm excited to see commitments coming in, particularly from the corporate sector, that really advance what we were talking about in terms of increasing funding for feminist movements overall. So to give a concrete example, as I'm sure many are aware, there are often huge barriers to receiving grants from corporations. There's hefty due diligence processes. There are lots of different parameters that groups must meet very strict requirements for. And so at least from the side of Gucci, we're starting to reevaluate that, to think how can we truly get funding to the grassroots level? How can we reimagine our protocols and processes that we have that might inadvertently be excluding people from accessing funding who need it the most? I'm also excited to see commitments coming in that really leverage the incredible public power that certain institutions might have, specifically corporations. So for example, within Changing Norms in Action Area 3, which is about increasing decision-making power and gender parity, how can companies use their ad budgets to confront stereotypes? How can we be using media to portray positive examples? How can we be using companies' consumer reach to bring men and boys into the fold as partners in the fight for gender equality? Those are the types of very concrete commitments that I hope people will bring to the table. I'm also mostly excited to see commitments that really are creative, ones that we haven't thought of. Our Action Coalition has put together some examples for sure, but I think that part of the process is having people bring their unique assets to bear, that people know, and I'm saying people generally, but I mean institutions, organizations, corporations, they know themselves the best and know what assets they have that can help this further our goals here. So I think all that to say that the example commitments that we're coming up with, perhaps taking a step back and being less prescriptive, while at the same time making sure that this isn't the equivalent of greenwashing, or that someone's not just joining for the sake of joining, and being able to say that they're doing something without having substance behind it. So we look forward to sharing those examples, I think, in the next draft of the blueprints, or perhaps some of them are already included. So trying to keep an open mind about what a commitment could mean, while also ensuring that we have a standard baseline of meaningful commitment behind it. And I think that comes down to data and accountability. How can we make sure that these are actually enforceable? How can we make sure that people are not using this as a PR opportunity, just to be perfectly blunt? And so those are my thoughts around the commitment model and what I hope to see.
Thanks, Stephanie. And if I may, just from the side of IWDA, we're also deeply committed to the urgent action that's required to dramatically increase funding to feminist activists and movements, particularly in our region, which is extremely underserved, the Pacific and Southeast Asia. But we're very excited about the possibility for renewed global commitment to transform the way we collect poverty data as part of these action coalitions around Action Area 3. If we're to achieve the promise of the Beijing Platform for Action around women and poverty, the global community must stop collecting gender insensitive individual level poverty data and instead step up to invest in individual level, intersectional, gender sensitive, multidimensional poverty measurement that will equip feminist movements and leaders with the quality data that they need to create sustainable change for women in all their diversity. On that note, I'd like to bring in Kavita and Zenaida. I wonder if you could share with the audience what they can do to contribute to the vision and a bit about the commitment makers model.
Zenaida, why don't you go first, por favor?
Gracias. Como lo he dicho, será... ¿Sí me escuchan? Bien. Creo que sí. Sí. Bueno, escucho un poco de eco. Ojalá que puedan escucharme bien ustedes. Sí.
We can hear you.
Bien. Creo que el principio justamente de cómo se puede ir pues materializando la interseccionalidad es seguir convocando a los grupos históricamente excluidos a que participen en estos espacios de reflexión, de análisis y de toma de decisiones. Ahora que se menciona también la responsabilidad de las empresas, las fundaciones, sería importante poner el foco también en el financiamiento hacia estos grupos que poco acceso han tenido a estas oportunidades, y sería positivo generar pues estos incentivos para que también tengan otras posibilidades para acceder a estos espacios. Si hablamos de una barrera que es el idioma, pues sería valioso invertir, aprender un idioma como el inglés para estos grupos, ¿no? Si hablamos de discapacidad, sería valioso también imaginar otras maneras de hacer accesible estos espacios para quienes no han tenido esa posibilidad de participar. También me parece que será importante seguir abriendo estos diálogos, no solo al interior de nuestras coaliciones, sino también al interior del sistema que promueve esto, de las empresas, de las propias Naciones Unidas, de todos los espacios donde se pueda pues generar estas reflexiones que fortalezcan nuestras miradas. Mientras más diversas sean, seremos también más incluyentes y respetuosas de la diversidad. Eso es lo que yo pediría, y me parece que los medios de comunicación también deberán asumir un rol importante para promover, justo como se decía en el cambio de las normas, pues las narrativas o lo que se pueda generar para ir bajando los prejuicios, los estigmas, los discursos antigénero, antiderechos, que están afectando al movimiento y que afectan también a sus integrantes. Entonces, yo me iría por esto, por hacer un poco más real la interseccionalidad y también por apostar en cuanto a financiamientos, poner el foco hacia las poblaciones que han sido más excluidas, que han quedado fuera de estos espacios de reflexión y participación, y llamaría a los medios, a las empresas privadas a sumarse a esta gran campaña para que la mayoría entendamos el valor de la diversidad y nunca más quede nadie fuera. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Zenaida. I think the discussions about commitments, I think, are really important for all of us to understand and also to recognize that there is a need to demystify some of the things. I think Zenaida said that there is like language that is very, that seems very distant from the grassroots, and even just the technology that we use and our reliance on digital technology can itself distance the vast majority of women and girls who may not be living with access to that technology. I think in that sense, for me, the way in which to think about what it means to be making a commitment to this work, and particularly to the advancement of feminist movements, is that we have to recognize, I often hear people say that, you know, the revolution will not be funded. And I often have to remind them that indeed all revolutions are funded in one way or another. They may not be funded always by very rich people. They may be funded by very rich people. They may be funded by the commitments people put in through mutual aid societies. So I think for me, one very big commitment, sitting as I do in the middle of a space of a private philanthropy, is to do all we can as feminists to democratize philanthropy and to put the power of these resources, financial resources, into the hands as much as possible of the communities and the constituencies that we want to be able to use these resources. Communities like Zenaida's, indigenous communities, communities of queer people, communities of sex workers, communities of people with disabilities. To do this, I think this Action Coalition has chosen to partner specifically with feminist funds and to commit to providing designated and direct funding to feminist and women-led organization groups, activists, and movements. But I think it is also important for us to recognize that even as we demand more resources, I think our own sense of what we bring to this work, our own commitment, is that we bring our own resources, we bring our own abilities, we bring our own voice, we bring our own power. And to me, it is incredibly important that we also manifest that. The notion that we must therefore uphold and adopt feminist principles in all types of funding, from government, from philanthropies, from corporations and individuals. For me, this means more than just saying, oh, we're going to increase our funding. It also means that I would like corporations to be having conversations about taxation. I would like us to be really thinking about, if we are corporations making luxury goods, do we really need in this world that we're going forward to have this much of an emphasis on things of great luxury, which only a few people can afford, while the vast majority of people can never afford them? We can, for those of us who are funders, remove onerous requirements and conditionality for funding. We look at the question, again, Zenaida mentioned, just the question of, if you're not speaking in English, if you're not writing in English, if you're not applying for funding in English, how much that disadvantages you, and what can we be doing about that? And we can be intentional about where money is going to make sure that funding is actually reaching groups that have traditionally had very little access to that kind of funding. Thirdly, I think we can look at who is making the decisions, who is at the table, who is, to what extent do private foundations or corporate foundations or even women's foundations have any commitment to forms of participatory decision making? To what extent are those who we say will be benefited by our resources able to sit at the tables with us to decide where those resources should go? What does it mean to have gender balanced representation in our work, and to be able to actually take that work forward? And I think the question there is really to push for this much greater access to women, girls, and non-binary people in all our diversity. And lastly, I think, we use the term leadership a lot, and actually it's often used very loosely. But I think if we are really talking about a new generation of leadership, then being willing to put money and resources into initiatives that are coming from a new generation of feminists, supporting them in building their own personal assets and their independence and being able to exercise their agency, not just in their own lives, but also in the participation of socioeconomic and political processes, is incredibly important. And so for me, these are the ways in which we can talk about being a commitment maker. And lastly, I will say to all of us who are in this space, we think of philanthropy as something Bill Gates and George Soros does, but really philanthropy in Greek only means love of humankind. Each one of us has that capacity to put our resources, however humble they may seem, into the service of something that we care about. And it is my real hope that part of what we take forward in this is a notion that all of us are philanthropists and all of us can actually make a commitment to feminist movements and leadership in our own ways. Thank you.
Thank you, Kavita. We are coming to the end of our time. I'd like to just suggest that we might not have time for another round of question and answers, but if the audience want to put in any burning questions or comments that they would like us to take into account into the Q&A, please do so now. We will definitely be recording those questions and reviewing them as a coalition. I'd now like to move to Anita Bhatia, who I think would like to make a contribution.
Thank you, Bronwyn. Thank you, Bronwyn. Now, I have listened very carefully to the discussion, and I just wanted to mention something that actually Kavita just mentioned at the very end, that I think on the question of funding, it is impossible to really see a big change without a big change in tax structures. Tax structures have enabled philanthropy. Tax structures have enabled CSR. Tax structures uphold systems. And so I think while there can be a call for more funding, I don't think that that can actually be solved without looking at the fundamentals of tax systems in most of the countries where one would want to see more funding directed towards women's organizations. So I wanted to make the point that I think it might be useful for the group as you consider what shape and form the blueprints take and what commitments can be made, whether as you seek to go forward and bring other partners on board, the set of partners that you bring on board also can speak to and help to drive thinking on the issue of what would be the ideal tax structures that incentivize the right kind of giving. Unfortunately, the current tax structure incentivizes a certain kind of philanthropy, and philanthropy which is frankly more self-interested many times than it is truly philanthropic. And there has not been that much writing or analysis of this. There have been a few writers in the last few years who have really pointed out just how insidious this system is. But without addressing this, I fear that we will not make really big change in the way funding is directed towards supporting and uplifting feminist organizations. Thank you.
Thanks for that contribution, Anita. So we're coming to the end of our time again. We have the results of the last poll in, it looks like promoting women's political participation and leadership is is coming out very strongly on that one. I'd like to encourage everyone to go to the Gender Equality Forum public platform, which is where these blueprints are in writing. There's a mechanism for you to comment on the blueprints. We really, really welcome your comments. There will be more touch points for your contributions and influence over the blueprints in the next 2 months before Paris. And as Subha mentioned before, this is a 5-year commitment. So we need to remember that we're all going to be improving and strengthening this process for the next 5 years. I'd like now to invite Sabine again to give a short overview of what's next for action coalitions and commitment making. Sabine.
Thank you so much, Bronwyn, for leading us through this session. And thank you so much, leaders and participants who have been part of this conversation today. It's really been a huge privilege to be here and to be part of this process. I also want to repeat the big thanks to our hosts in Mexico, and particularly to the feminist and youth movements in Mexico and in the region who continue to inspire us and have been such a great support and inspiration during this forum. It's been so inspirational to see the transformative blueprints here today. And as we've emphasized, this is still a draft. And as Bronwyn just said, we are welcoming suggestions and comments, especially to increase the diversity of voices and interests reflected in the blueprints. So we invite you to join the GEF Public Conversation platform and to provide comments there. You can do it today and tomorrow, or you can continue to do it over the next month. So please do feel free to join that platform to provide your comments on the blueprints that we have shared. As many have mentioned today, there is still a need to further open the action coalitions and their processes to make sure that they are transparent, inclusive, and that they allow all voices to be heard. As Zenaida pointed out, this also means breaking the digital divide and ensuring those who do not have the same access to technology are supported to participate fully. For those of you who are online today, my request is that you bring these blueprints back home, that you bring them back to your communities and to your partners, and generate a conversation about the blueprints to provide more comments and more inputs. UN Women will, of course, be doing the same with our own offices around the world to try to ensure that there are greater voices and more expressions of diversity in the platforms. As we are heading towards the Paris Forum, we encourage, of course, all leaders to make bold and groundbreaking commitments. Some very good concrete examples were already shared today. We call on other stakeholders, some of you who are listening to us today, and to all of our partners to join the Action Coalition effort as commitment makers. Commitment makers will play a catalytic role in the success of the Action Coalitions. Commitment makers will contribute to the finalization of the blueprints and, of course, to their implementation and to their monitoring over the next 5 years. We have a great responsibility to ensure that the commitments are fully implemented, and this is a process that we'll be following up on during the coming 5 years. The application platform for commitment making is also being launched now at the Generation Equality Forum website, and this will be open as well between now and Paris. So we look forward to receiving your commitments over the coming months. Thank you so much for your transformative commitments. They will help enable us to ensure that these action coalitions are successful and that we really do bring the promise of Beijing forward over the next 5 years, and that we are able to ensure equal rights and opportunities for women and girls around the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sabine. I think everyone can see the amazing graphic recording of our conversation today. Thank you to the graphic recorder. Thank you so much to all of our panelists and to the audience for joining us here today. And I'll close it there. Thanks again.
Thank you, Bronwyn, for being a great moderator.
Thank you.